Hi, everyone. So the recording function on Microsoft Teams didn't work like we wanted it to during our September webinar, but I wanted to go ahead and present these slides so we could get it uploaded to the website because I think it's some really good information for employers. So what we talked about during our September webinar was the ADA and kind of took a deep dive into that. The first thing that I wanted to bring to everybody's attention was really just a timeline of the history of the disability rights movement. So the Rehabilitation Act of 1954 was obviously passed in 1954. The disability rights movement had been going on long before this, and some of the sit-ins and protests was what really prompted the Rehabilitation Act to be passed. However, even after it was passed through Congress, the president at the time did not necessarily want to sign it into law. And even after it was signed into law, enforcement of it was pretty much non-existent. So protests continued to happen. Enforcement began. And then there was a couple of amendments to that. And then the Vocational Rehabilitation Act was passed in 1973, which was amazing because that provided funding and the organization of vocational rehabilitation at the federal level, which obviously was then passed down to the states. And then in 1990, George H.W. Bush passed the ADA. Now, since 1990, there has been a few amendments to that, mainly regarding the definition of disability, including some other language that was meant to not exclude different individuals that should be covered under the ADA, but wasn't exactly in there. So, like I said, even when the Rehabilitation Act was passed, enforcement wasn't there. And it actually took a sit-in to force that reinforcement. And Judy Humes is one of the main recognizable faces of the disability rights movement. There's actually a documentary that is amazing that's on Netflix. It's called Crip Camp. It was actually produced by the Obamas, and it really details that whole disability rights movement, what it took to get these things passed, and the impact that it had on the individuals during that time. So it's great if anybody wants to watch that. This bottom picture that you see on the slide is actually from what ended up being called the Capitol Crawl. So again, the ADA was passed through Congress. President Bush was really hesitant to sign it into law, and it kind of sat there for a long time. Disability rights protesters began protesting at the Capitol and around Washington, D.C. And that actually forced President Bush to sign that into law. But this picture is notable because what was going on during this time was at that protest, these individuals with disabilities gave up all of their mobility devices, their wheelchairs, their crutches, anything that they used, and made a point to get to the top of the Capitol stairs. And this was significant because it just showed that, a whole group of people in our society weren't able to participate in their government like everybody else, because they couldn't even get up to the Capitol. So what exactly is the ADA? So the Americans with Disabilities Act, of course, was passed in 1990. It's a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. It's divided into different sections called titles. The one we're going to really look at today is Title I, that directly relates to employment, and it protects a qualified individual from discrimination and provides reasonable accommodations. Now, there's some definitions within the ADA that are very important, and the first one that we're going to talk about is this definition of qualified. So, for the purposes of the ADA, this means a person that satisfies the skill, experience, education, and any other job-related requirements of the position that is sought or held with or without reasonable accommodations. And why this is important is because we want to, make sure that that covered person is actually qualified to do that position. The ADA does not state that you have to hire anybody that is not qualified. You don't have to hire them just because they have a disability. But if they can do all of the duties of that job with or without reasonable accommodations, then they are protected under the ADA if they have a disability. Other titles that are included in the ADA, Title II ensures equal opportunity to participate and benefit from state and local government's programs, services, and activities. Title III discusses public accommodations, which most businesses or buildings that offer goods or service to the general public are considered public accommodations. No individual with a disability may be discriminated against or denied the full use of goods, services, facilities, privileges, or accommodations offered by a public accommodation. And then Titles 4 and 5 address telecommunications and other miscellaneous activities. It required telephone companies to provide relay services, closed captioning. It also requires websites to be accessible. So this is important to employers because most of the job applications, all of that stuff, onboarding procedures are all done online these days. So making sure that your website is accessible to everyone, so they're able to submit those applications, do any onboarding procedures that you want, etc. So who must comply with the ADA? So all private employers with 15 or more employees, whether that is full-time or part-time employees, must comply with the ADA. All state and local governments, employment services, and labor unions. Again, we're going to go over a super important definition here, the definition of disability. The ADA defines a person with a disability as one who has a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activities. This includes people who have a record of such an impairment, even if they currently do not have a disability. Record of in this statement means that the person has a history of or has been misclassified as having a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities, even though the person does not currently have a disability. The definition of disability also includes individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded as having a disability. Regarded as in this statement means that the person either has an impairment that may not substantially limit a major life activity, has an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity only as a result of the attitude of others towards them, or does not have any impairment but is treated by an entity as having an impairment. These definitions, especially the last two, are kind of confusing. So if you have any questions about those, feel free to reach out to us. We can go over exactly what those two mean. So when we talk about major life activities, what are we talking about? These are some examples here: breathing, walking, talking, hearing, seeing, sleeping, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, or working. So as a business, when do you have to comply with the ADA? So you have to comply with the ADA the second you post a job opening and are accepting applications. Reasonable accommodations can be requested at application. And during the webinar, we asked our participants, what are some examples of reasonable accommodations that may be requested at the time of application or interview? So some examples that were brought up were one relating to the online application. So an individual may request to be able to do that on paper or on person. That would be a reasonable request. Another thing that we see a lot is the ability for somebody to accompany that individual with a disability to an interview. So the individual with a disability may be requesting that because they may be nonverbal. They may have difficulties processing. They may have a speech difficulty, which limits others' ability to understand them. Or, they may just have a mental health disorder such as anxiety that prevents them from being able to think in what could be a stressful situation. So, requesting somebody to accompany them to the interview, to maybe speak for them, or to rephrase questions in a way that they understand, or to be there to lessen their anxiety is definitely um, a reasonable accommodation request that should be granted. So, what are reasonable accommodations? An accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal opportunities. There are three different categories of reasonable accommodations. The first one is modifications or adjustments to a job application process, modifications or adjustments to the work environment or to the manner or circumstance under which the position is performed, or modifications or adjustments that enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment that are enjoyed by others. So, we talked about modifications or adjustments to the job application process. When we're talking about adjustments to the work environment, this could be, providing a stool to somebody that may need to sit instead of stand. It may be, um, providing a taller desk to someone that uses a wheelchair for mobility so they can fit under the desk. Or it could be adjustments to the actual work environment. So, allowing them to maybe work in a different part of um, the building or the area that is accessible if the rest of the building is not accessible. So there's all kinds of adjustments and things that can be made here. So when we talk about reasonable accommodations, we have to talk about what is reasonable. So an accommodation is reasonable if it seems reasonable on its face. It is reasonable if it is feasible and plausible. It also must be effective in meeting the needs of the individual. So what are some examples of reasonable accommodations on the work site? So one of the things that we, just talked about, so modifications to the work environment, but it may also be something that looks like a modification to a schedule. So, maybe you have an employee that is granted, one 30-minute break, and because of, a physical disability or stamina, or, maybe they have diabetes and they need to eat a snack at a certain time, you may be able to divide that 30-minute break up into two 15-minute breaks. Or maybe divide that 30-minute break up into three 10-minute breaks. If that allows that person with a disability to perform their job duties, and it meets their needs, then that's definitely reasonable. Another thing that might be reasonable is if you generally have um, only full-time positions, but you have an individual with a disability that is definitely qualified for the position, but maybe something limits them to only being able to work 4 or 5 hours a day. Adjusting that shift to make that a part-time position is also reasonable. So when an employee needs accommodations, how can they request those? A formal process is not required, and a person's lack of beginning the formal process does not stop the request. A person can ask for an accommodation with or without using the word accommodation. Another person can request an accommodation for an individual, and it doesn't have to be in writing. Now, most places do have a formal accommodation request, or process, but if that individual tells their immediate supervisor, hey, I need this for this reason, then that definitely starts the request process, and their ability or inability to complete that formal request process does not stop um, that accommodation request. So another term that's used in the ADA is undue hardship. So what is undue hardship? Well, this is the only time a reasonable accommodation does not have to be performed or allowed is if it places an undue hardship on the employer. This is determined on a case-by-case basis, takes into account the accommodation request, the nature of the business, and the business's financial situation. Can a business request documentation of a disability? Yes, but only if the disability is not obvious. Information obtained can only be used to determine if the individual qualifies for an accommodation requested. If the individual cannot provide disability information, you can request that they see a medical professional of your choosing, and you cannot require a medical professional to determine accommodations. One of the most important things that I can say about this accommodations process is keeping an open line of communication between you and the employee. The employee knows what they need, and you know what you can provide. And then we get into service animals because this is a big question these days. Emotional support animals are not service animals, and I think sometimes they get grouped into that. So, what are service animals exactly as a definition of the ADA? They're animals that are individually trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. They must be harnessed, tethered, or leashed at all times. And in regards to service animals, you may only ask two questions about the animal. Is the animal required because of a disability? And what work or tasks has the animal been trained to perform? So just some best practices when you're working with an individual with a disability and you have questions regarding the ADA. Make sure that you train everyone who interviews, hires, or supervises employees on the ADA. So one of the things that we see a lot is HR professionals completely have that information, but it's often not passed down to their lower level managers who are actually working with the individuals. So we want to make sure everybody is trained on the ADA and what that looks like. Make sure everyone is aware of the process when an accommodation is requested. This process, again, does not have to be formal, and in reality, the best accommodations are provided through discussion and getting to know the needs of the employee. Understand that the fact that others may want the same accommodation is not an undue hardship, and ask trained professionals for help. Anybody can get a hold of us here at Scene anytime. We're more than happy to help. We're more than happy to provide trainings. Definitely just let us know what you need. And then looking forward to October, October's webinar will be held October 8th from 11 to 12. We are going to be discussing employee resource groups and have a guest speaker, Jeanette Tolbert. And again, registration for that is available on the website. I hope this has been informational for everybody. I'm sorry that it's kind of a condensed version from the actual webinar, but again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. We want to be there for you. We want to help train. We want to help educate. Um, just feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you.